This is a portrait of her when she was around 30, taken in 1850. She was born to Archibald and Elizabeth Ann Jenkinson in Clinton, Maryland, which is just south and a little east of Washington, D.C., and is now known as, became known as Surrattville, but we'll get to that. She had two brothers, John and James Jenkins, and her father died when she was only 2. And so her mother, oddly enough, from what you've already heard today and probably knew, her mother did get to inherit their property. So that was perhaps unusual in the time, but that probably kept them from being totally destitute. Her mother used the help of her sister, who was a devout Catholic, and that influenced where Mary and her brothers went to school. They all went to Catholic school for their training, and Mary eventually converted to Catholicism. She met John Harrison Surratt, her husband-to-be, in I have 1939, but I know that's wrong. In 1839, and married him a year later. And he, of course, she being a Catholic, he had to convert to marry in their church. So they all became Catholics. John purchased a mill in Oxon Hill, Maryland, where they lived for quite a few years. And Oxon Hill, Maryland, is also just a little bit south of Washington, D.C. We'll see that shortly on a map. The two of them, Mary and John, had 3 kids. Isaac, you can skip to the next slide. Here is their family tree. There are apparently no pictures of John Surratt, but there's Mary, and below are her 3 children. And let's have a little more, go to the next slide, a close-up of the 3 children. The first one there is Isaac. He's the oldest. He and his older brother on the end, John Jr., were both very much involved in Southern sympathy. They were Southern sympathizers. Maryland, although it didn't secede from the Union, was filled with a mixture of Southern sympathizers as well as Northern sympathizers. And this family, I didn't find much to say about the middle one, Anna, but definitely the 2 boys were definitely Southern sympathizers. And we'll see more about that. I'll get more to that after I proceed a little bit further on Mary. So Mary married John in 1840, and they lived in Oxon Hill. Why don't you go to the next slide? And here is Surrattville, and this is a woodcut of their home and the surrounding things. They built quite a, you could say they were prosperous for their whole life, but that didn't really mean they were happily married. John borrowed a lot of money, and he also was a raging alcoholic and somewhat abusive. So it wasn't a marriage made in heaven. So in spite of the fact they lived prosperously, they had a lot of debts. And he managed his debts by selling off property. So, but before they got to here, they were the farm they were living in Oxon Hill burned to the ground. And so that's when they did move to this place in Surrattville. And here's a close-up of their house. If you jump to the next slide, this will give you a better idea of where everything is. Washington is up there. Here is where this the woodcut you saw is, and they were describing that as being at a nice crossing roads where lots of traffic going various places. And it talked about getting people that were coming to and from Marlborough and to and from Piscataway, thank you. As well as people who are going to and from Washington, D.C. So this Surrattville, where the house was, which is now called Clinton, was quite a place where people were passing through. And just to reference you, here's where their first farm was, on Oxen Hill.
Oh.
And since we have the map up here, let me just also point up here, Mount Olivet Cemetery. That's where Mary and her two of her children are buried. So, so just a quickie about the son's involvement in the intrigue that happens. Her one son, Isaac, left just after Lincoln's inauguration and went to Texas and joined the Confederate States Army. So he was actually serving for the South. And John Jr. was a lot more involved in the entire intrigue that took place about the assassination. That's not what I'm going to be covering, but John, and after, although he didn't specifically carry out any activity in the assassination itself, he was well aware of it. He was acted as a spy and traveled, carried information across the Potomac. By the way, this is the Potomac here that we saw in that earlier slide. So he would carry Union information across that the Potomac River and relay it to the Southern people. So I think that's about all I have to say about the early years of Mary Surratt and her family.
Is this you? That slide?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, at her boarding, at her farm. This is what's his face? You know, I mean, what's his face? This is Lafayette Baker, who you may have heard referred to earlier. Yeah. He is like on the Secret Service for the government. Mm-hmm. So he was suspicious of the Surratt House, where many suspicious people hung out, and they were indeed suspicious people. Because a lot of the plotting took place there in the tavern and boarding houses. And so he had arrested some of the people there and probably had an opportunity to catch some of the others had he been able to find more evidence there. But he had arrested people at her boarding house before the assassination, but failed to notice that John Jr. was a collaborator. John was a postmaster for a while. He took the place. His father was a postmaster, the one who died, the drunk guy, who he did eventually die. But John Jr. Both of them were postmasters, but John Jr. lost his job, and that caused them some financial difficulty. And probably increased his resentment because he appeared to be a Southern sympathizer, so he lost his job. So the one other thing for which Mary is famous is she was the first woman ever executed by the United States government.
Oh, wow.
Where
was she? Where? Do you know, Diane?
Where what?
Where was she executed? Do you know?
Right there in Washington.
Yeah.
We'll be seeing
Yes,
lots of pictures of her soon. Yeah, and she was buried up there in Washington D.C. with her children. So, without further ado.
One last thing on the tavern. Part of what also makes it important is that's where John Wilkes Booth would stop 13 years later on the night of April 14th, 1865, during his escape. So that's why you got to remember that place, among other things. So when John Surratt died in 1862, he left them considerably in debt. Costs were increasing, the war was on. He had sold the tavern in order to cover his debts. Bills went uncollected, and they were in bad shape. The tavern and farm were in jeopardy. So Mary rented the tavern and the farm to an ex-policeman named John Lloyd. No, and most of these names I'm going to throw out, you're going to hear later because they're all involved. And in October of 1864, Mary and her children, John and Annie, Anna moved into the townhouse, which was on the map as 541 H Street in Washington. So there she started being a respectable occupation of running a boarding house. Lost that one. It has this, you see the street level entrance, and that contained the kitchen and the dining room and a small hallway with the stairs leading both from inside and out to the main living room on the second floor, with a fireplace, and she had her own room, private sitting room, and that comes into the story too. And then bedrooms a large bedroom on the rest of that floor, facing the rear of the building overlooking a porch. The third floor was a parlor and a bedroom in the front, and another large bedroom in the rear. The attic is undersized. I imagine the men were probably like that. Of course, they were shorter then. Not as comfortable, but it had low dormered roof line, and it could be used for 2 bedrooms and a sitting area. And it was there that John Wilkes Booth came to know the Surratt family. Dr. Samuel Mudd introduced him to John Surratt Jr., who she said was Confederate spy and messenger, and John became good friends. And there were other people later identified as co-conspirators who also frequented the boarding house. It is unclear how much she knew about all the activities, and there were several plans to kidnap the president, and plans changed. So the president was going to be at Ford's Theater and we're going to kidnap him. No, they decided not to go. The president's going to be taking a ride today along the river. Something came up and they didn't go. And that's why the assassination was really such a last-minute plot, because they found out that day he was definitely going to be there. But otherwise, they would have kidnapped him, taken him south, and used him as ransom to get all the Confederate prisoners released. So none of that happened. Lewis Paine, who sometimes went under another name, stayed at least one night. And John Wilkes Booth was there quite often. So, she had a boarder named Louis Weichmann.
I had him.
Okay, I know you do.
One before.
And one day she asked him if he would take a trip with her out to, hold on, I missed that one up. Okay. Out to Surrattville to deliver some stuff. And on the way, they met John Lloyd, and she said to him, shooting irons are there, somebody had dropped them off, and you'll have to hide them because they're going to be needed soon. My papers are out of order.
Who was Weichmann?
He was a boarder, and he was a friend of John's. They had known each other from when they were kids. So, came into town to live, and he was in and out of there, but he saw these people coming and going in private conversations, and, kind of wondered about it, but didn't say anything. And she said, gee, would you drive me out to this farm so I can drop some stuff? And what she took was John's gloves and some other things.
There's several Johns, so.
Yeah, Booth's gloves. And part of what's interesting to think about traveling, it was a 12-mile trip, and it took 2.5 hours each way. On the day of the assassination, they did this trip twice. She went out in the morning with Whiteman driving her, because I guess women really shouldn't be out on the road alone. So she delivered Booth's field glasses and reminded Lloyd to ready the weapons, because somebody would be there later. And Lloyd testified to all this stuff at the trial, so he comes in a lot on that. And then Weichmann saw her talking quietly to John Wilkes Booth at the tavern. And at 9 o'clock that night, he stopped at her house. They had a private conversation in her sitting room, and of course they never saw each other again. At midnight after the assassination, Booth and David Harold stopped at the tavern to collect the things that Mary had left for them. So this is part of, did she, didn't she?
Yeah.
So because of the detective, within hours, somebody stopped, they came to the boarding house, searched the house, questioned everybody, found nothing except the carte de visite which is the kind of thing you'd put into somebody's house if you were coming to visit, a little card of some sort. On the back of it was a photograph of John Wilkes Booth. And Anna, who everybody believes knew nothing, she hid that card. But they found it, the detectives found it. So it does kind of, makes you wonder. So, okay. Anyway, so she was arrested. On April 17th, charged with conspiracy and aiding the assassins and assisting their escape. When they were arresting her, Lewis Paine, also known as Powell, so his other last name, a definite conspirator, he was one they were interested in, showed up at the boarding house to see her, and then they're suddenly trying to make like they don't know each other. And the men were smart enough to figure that out, so they took both of them to a general's office for questioning, and she kept trying to protect herself and say, oh yeah, Booth came to the house, but he knows my son John, and that's it. And, oh, I'm shocked about the attack, and I didn't know any of this was going on, and that kind of thing, and tried to tone down her pro-Confederate views. But the more they listened to her, they said, yeah, it sounds like, you get your hand in the cookie jar and you try to think of 20,000 excuses so mom won't kill you. And it's that kind of a thing. She just talked herself more and more into trouble. And her daughter Anna was with her, and they kept her for a while in the Carroll Annex in Washington's old Capitol prison. And they had read the charges to them, and a week after arrest, Dr. Mudd was arrested. Yeah, this is where we're going to be next, yeah. The next few weeks, as they said, it was terrible. Incredibly unsanitary conditions, rooms plagued by filth and squalor, rats, roaches, bed bugs, and fleas.
Yeah.
You leave anything out. It was dehumanizing and degrading, well, I think any prison would be. By April 20th, the authorities had rounded up 4 more conspirators. Sam Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, and these guys kind of out on the edge. They really didn't do a lot. Ed Spangler and George Surratt, who did do a lot. By the end of the month, they would be transferred to the Arsenal prison. That's the one you just had. Yeah. To wait their trial, and none of them left there. John Lloyd had been arrested and questioned in Surrattsville. Shortly afterwards, he told all he knew and testified against the others. By the 29th, the decision was made to prosecute Dr. Mudd, Ed Spangler, David Harold, Lewis Paine, George Surratt, Michael O'Laughlin, and Mary Surratt. The others, Samuel Cox, Thomas Jones, John Lloyd, Louis Weichmann, Sarah Slater, who was a family friend, and Thomas Harbin, were in prison, but none would face charges, and they were all released fairly early on. John Surratt Jr. was in Canada. Did he come home and stand up for his mom? No. Which, doesn't speak well. After the dramatic events of the Lincoln assassination, we're going to skip what happens to her after this because somebody else is going to talk about that. So after all this, the family was unable to keep up. The debts were now astronomical. So they auctioned off the home in 1868. Nowadays, the boarding house, I think we're down to the last one.
Oh, it's way back here.
It's way back there.
Okay. Here it is.
Whoops. Okay, it's called The Walk, W-O-K, The Walk and Roll Restaurant. And the tavern is now the Surratt House Museum.
Oh, my gosh.
And 5 separate families lived in the former tavern from 1868 to 1965, when the property was acquired by the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, Department of Parks and Recreation, Prince George's County, this goes on, it's like the families there, Natural and Historical Resources Division. So after years of campaigning, fundraising, restoration, the tavern opened as the first operating museum in Prince George's County, Maryland on May 1st, 1976. Good year. The historic Surratt House is now a museum which presents programs and events recapturing the history of mid-19th century life, as well as telling the fascinating story of the conspiracy to assassinate an American president.
I did find The Assassin's Accomplice an excellent book, at least to try to examine how the trial went. There's a great deal of information It dovetails very nicely with what you've heard from the prior presenters today. We did not prepare each, I've been out of town, I've been in Arizona with the grandchildren for up to a month and just got back in on Wednesday. So I may read from this. So I don't have a chance to really dovetail a lot with what's been said, but there's a few things that really you have to take into consideration when you look at this whole case. So I'm not up to present either the prosecutor or the defense or to be the judge in this case. Hopefully you guys can all do this, and we're passing around piece of paper. And I know Pam said whether we're going to guilt or innocence. Normally in a trial there's two phases. First, did they do it? Is there guilt or innocence? Secondly, what's going to be the punishment? Because there was a serious question here, as especially Mary Surratt, and what we should do with her. And people have mentioned it, so it's not the cat out of the bag. She was the first woman hung in the United States. And in her defense, one of the things that her counsel tried to stress was, we're really going to hang a woman? We're really going to commit this woman to death? The first time? It's a federal case now, remember. Now here's a couple of other interesting things. Keep into account, I'm really wearing three hats here. Prosecutor, counsel for the defense, and the jury. You guys can be the jury. So I'm going to kind of jump around, just like everybody else has said. But there are a few things to keep track of up front, and you've kind of heard a few snippets of it as you've gone along. One of the ones is to think about Mary Surratt and where she came from. You heard some background. Absolutely correct. Old man John Sr., call him John Sr., he was an alcoholic, and he was a drunk, and he was a gambler. So he ran up a lot of debts. He did get hundreds of acres down there in where it was Surrattsville before it was. And as he would go along and get into trouble, they'd chop off 40 acres, they'd chop off 10 acres. They would just continue to reduce and reduce and reduce the property to pay off his debts. Because he drank, and he was a bad drunk, and he gambled and ran up these debts, and that was the only way they could do it. One of the things that's in here is there was a debt that Mary inherited from John Sr. to a man named Calvert. And Mary also was owed money from a man named Nothay. And Calvert and Nothay got together and said, listen, if Nothay pays Mary, Mary can pay Calvert, and Mary get off that hook. That's important because on the day that's in question, 4/14, one of the reasons Louis Weichmann had to take Mary out to Surrattsville was to meet with this guy Nothay to get what was owed there to pay Calvert off. Calvert and Nothay made the decision, they made a deal, but they needed Mary to cooperate, okay? That was a cover. Mary could have a reason to have to go out to Surrattsville on the 14th to meet with Nothay. But when you look into it, Nothay was 3 miles away from when he was there. She never pushed it. Calvert's on top of her, where's my money? I know Nothay will pay you and you can pay me. She gave Nothay 10 days to pay. So that was brought out in the trial, and people were questioning whether or not Mary, innocent Mary, stoic Mary, you saw her picture, was out there really trying to make this resolution, or was that just an excuse for Mary and Louis Weichmann to get out there and say, John Lloyd, get it ready? So let's look at what John Lloyd was. John Lloyd bought the property from Mary, owed $500 a year to have the tavern. Now I did hear people say it was a house, but they over time, John Sr., built it up. He had a blacksmith shop, he had a store there, he had a tavern, he had some property that he was renting out. So he had a nice little deal going, so he had money coming in, but he was gambling and drinking as fast as the money was coming in. And he was a postmaster, which was mentioned, which is important. But they also were spies. The Surratts were staunch Confederates, very big Confederates. And you saw the map, you're about that far away from Virginia, which is the South, okay? You cross that river and you're in Confederate territory. And when you heard another one earlier this morning, how the people, the poor guys, when Herod and Booth were trying to get away, go south, idiot, make a left. No, he's going north. There's a couple of good stories in there. They got lost, the wind and the river and the currents, and that's the Potomac. It's subject to tides. So the guys got all turned and twisted and all messed up, Booth and Herod, when they're trying to get out of there. And that was by accident, not too smart, whatever. Herod was a birder, meaning he shot birds, not he looked at birds. He wanted to do it. He was brought into the situation because he knew those, supposedly, all the swamps, all the wilds, all the ins and outs. Remember, it was initially a kidnapping, and somebody was right. There were 3 or 4 different versions of the kidnapping. And Booth, supposedly, He was portrayed as his father and his brothers were better. He was a very famous actor. He was well known, and he did know his stuff. He was a good actor, okay? He knew that play, even though he hadn't done the play, knew it by heart. He knew exactly when to shoot Lincoln. When the laugh would occur, it would cover the shot. The other thing I heard is he caught a spur in that, in the bunting, and that's what turned his right leg. He landed on his left, and that's when he broke the left leg. The other thing, and I'm jumping around a bit because I don't know how much to cover. Mudd, when he first was examined, oh, I don't know, some mysterious guy shows up in the middle of the night with a broken leg and I helped him. I don't know who he was. Mudd was a conspirator. Mudd was a spy. Mudd was a Confederate. He knew exactly what's going on. He took the boot off of John Wilkes and set the leg for him, and Wilkes went off and got shot in a barn by Corbett, which was very interesting. Shot him through the slats. He was told specifically, he ain't getting away. He ain't going to go to trial. Boom, Corbett took him out. Shot him in the neck, about 3 inches below where Lincoln got shot. Kind of ironic. Paralyzed, brought him out of the place, stuck him by the tree. 6 hours, 7 hours. Booth lived before he finally died. Last words supposedly were useless, useless. That's what I read in terms of Booth. So backing up to Mudd, they go back to Mudd's a second time, and now the feds, and there's Washington police and there's U.S. Union Army people looking for stuff. They comb Mudd's house, and guess what they find? John Wilkes Booth's boot. Oh, Dr. Mudd, what is this? What is that? I have no idea. Guess whose initials are inside the boot? JWB. Dr. Booth, Dr. Mudd, you're coming with us. And he did get her. No, but he never was tried for the conspiracy. Turns out Mudd and Booth were gumbats. Mudd and Booth were using, John's looking to buy a property in southern Maryland as a cover so that they could meet with all these people. I think it was December 22nd, 1864. Going by memory. If I'm wrong, give me a B+. October 22nd, 1864, Booth and Mudd are in Washington, and Mudd is trying to help Booth get together this whole panoply of people he's going to need because they're going to kidnap Lincoln and whisk him down to Richmond, okay? Meanwhile, remember, Grant is outside of Richmond bringing home the sheaves. He's on, remember if Grant with the seven battles, the 7 wars, around to the left, around to the left. Every time Lee would faint, and then Grant would go around to Lee's left, and around 7 wars or 7 days or something. He fought and fought and fought, and finally got him to a point where Grant's outside of Richmond, okay? I'm sorry if I'm walking around too much, I can't help it. Mudd and Booth are walking along Washington, and who do they bump into but John Surratt and, let me think, it was Booth and Mudd, Surratt, and Louis Weichmann. Louis Weichmann, you saw him, is a key person. Louis Weichmann and John Lloyd are the 2 people that put Mary Surratt in the noose, when it all comes to it. They have a chance meeting, and Booth thinks this is wonderful because Mudd's been telling Booth, this guy Surratt is your man. You need him in southern Maryland. Someone said he was a postman. They're absolutely right. His old man was too, but he was a spy, and being a postmaster was perfect. What the Confederates would do? Address a letter to Jim Doyle, and then he's a known guy, he's a Union guy, no problem. Inside it is a letter to Pam Mount. Pam Mount is a Confederate spy, okay? Jim Doyle gets the letter as the postmaster, opens it up and says, here, Pam, you need to see this. And it's money, it's something. So he was perfect to be in that position. Herod is there, knows the area, knows the boats. George Ezra Dodd is there. He is a cabinet maker, but he also does a lot of boats. And he was key at trying to hire a boat. The details are there. You can look them up. Somebody said before, it's all over the place. You're absolutely right. I forget the name. Ezra Dodd gets the boat, $250 for a rowboat. To get what? Lincoln and Booth and all the conspirators across the Potomac and on to Richmond to free all the Confederate soldiers. Now Booth, for all his planning, and he did have money, and the Canadian government helped him, and the Confederate government helped him, how's he going to do this? He's going to get them from Washington, you saw it, but back in those days on old rutted roads, and sneak them off to Washington to do what? Free all the Confederate soldiers in Union jails? That was the plan, supposedly well schemed out, but it didn't seem to come to fruition. But that was his plan. That was what he was after. And so on March 22nd, I think it was, Ezra Dodd, Herod, and Surratt go out to the Surratt Tavern and meet with John Lloyd. John Lloyd in January rented the tavern and everything from Mary Surratt for $500. They tell John, we got a plan, we're not going to tell you much about it. We have 2 carbines, a box of ammunition, a wrench that helps, a special wrench for the kind of buggies that they had at the time, and one other thing, I forget what it was. Hide them. Lloyd says, no, I don't want to do it, I don't want to do it. Lloyd, you got to do it. Well, where am I going to put it? Where am I going to put it? John Surratt says, I know where. Upstairs, in the back. Remember that they lived behind it, and the tavern was in front. In an area, like a storage area where it's nothing, they put the carbine and the ammunition and the wrench in the wall and hang it down with a rope so you can't see it when you go up there and look. Okay? That's important too. Because later on, Mary, and later on, the Union. So, this is in March. Mary goes out on 4/11 with Louis Weichmann. Now, who's Louis Weichmann? Louis Weichmann was an old friend, a good college buddy of John Surratt Jr. They were tight. Louis Weichmann happened to be in Washington trying to get into the seminary down in Richmond, and he was trying to get all the approvals and the necessary stuff from all the priests or all the people they wanted to get involved in. Louis Weichmann was trusted by John Surratt. John Surratt was trusted by Louis Weichmann. John Surratt Jr., senior's long gone, is very much involved in this meeting. When they first had that chance meeting, when Booth and Surratt and Mudd and Louis Weichmann meet, they all go to the National Hotel, where I think Booth was staying. And they meet in the hall, and they're separate. And Weichmann is left there, you know. Booth had a lot of money. He had the Confederates supporting him. He was making money as an actor, etc. Brandy and cigars in the war room, gentlemen. So they all go in by the fireplace. And pretty soon, Booth and Surratt worked their way out to the hallway. And there's Louis. Now, Louis Weichmann worked in the pharmacy, United States Pharmacy. He had a Union uniform. He's sitting there wearing a Union uniform. Mudd is talking to him saying, oh, yes, this is important. We are, my loyalty to the United States government is strong. Why is he doing that? Probably because there's Weichmann sitting there with a Union uniform on, and he knows that Booth and Surratt are out there meeting for the first time, trying to make this plan to kidnap Nixon. Listen. See, Freud would say. So then Mudd leaves and goes out and joins them. Then they all 3 come back, and then Booth and John Surratt Jr. meet at a table over by the fireplace, and Booth is writing down things on a napkin. Another napkin. You have how many great ideas on napkins? He's writing down things on the napkin as to what to do. That is the theory of when that conspiracy was formed, when those people got in there. And Weichmann just happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, at the right place at the right time. It's hard to say. But his testimony later on, he saw a signed affidavit, and he's called as, I think, the first major witness for the prosecution. That comes later. Now, before we get to the trial, there are key dates in here, and there's a bunch of other stuff that's happening. I'll just mention it because it is important. From the timeline, if you'll recall, one of the issues when it comes to trial is where are we going to try Mary? That comes to that in a minute. But at the time that this is happening, the conspirators first meet March 15 and then March 22nd. There's the second inauguration. On April 9, Lee surrenders. Are we still at war? Should we be having a military tribunal? Should Mary Surratt be tried in the civil court? If the civil court's in action, doesn't the civil court take precedence over the military court? Wait a minute. Lee may have surrendered, but there's still skirmishes and fights all over the place. The Union isn't won necessarily. The Confederacy hasn't given up. They could still come storming in here. Stonewall Jackson, I think it was one. He's out there in Virginia someplace, tearing up the countryside. Are we still at war? So one of the issues there is, are we at war? Should she be tried in a military tribunal? That's where she was tried. John Speed, who was the United States Attorney General at the time, said, there's a declaration of war, we're still at war, the surrender of Lee is not sufficient, this lady's going to be tried in, all 8 of them are going to be tried in a military tribunal. So she was tried in a military court. What's the significance? What's the difference? Why mention that? Because in a military court, the prosecutor also is the judge and jury. There are 12 people, 12 men, who were all Army colonels and generals and veterans. They were a military court. And the standard is not beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt is the one you get in a civil court. If I'm going to take your liberty away and put you in jail, I better be able to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. One of my law school stories, professor, teacher, well, what's beyond a reasonable doubt? Well, the attorney's giving the closing presentation and says, because we haven't found the body yet, if John Smith walked in that doorway, you'd have a reasonable doubt. And everybody in the jury looks, okay? Well, there's a reasonable doubt. We all thought maybe John Smith's going to walk in. Except the coming back was, except for the foreman. Because the foreman was looking at the defendant. Guess who didn't look to see if John Smith walked in? Your client, the defendant. Everybody else thought it was, but your client didn't look for John Smith, so he didn't have a reasonable doubt. They convicted that guy. The other thing, when you have proof like this, when you have testimony in court, this whole thing about sic semper tyrannis that supposedly Booth spoke when he jumped down on the stage, there are eyewitnesses. He never got past sic semper. He never said sic semper. He said death to tyrants. Nobody in that room could agree. When I was in law school, they have this example. I should have done it today. In the middle of my evidence class, almost the first class, we're standing there, professor steps forward. Somebody runs in, writes something on the board, erases it, and runs out. And the professor says, stop. Write down 5 things you just saw. Okay? 30 people in the evidence classroom. Okay? Of the 5 things that we saw, not any one of the 5s matched up. Was it a man? Was it a woman? There was disparity. Were they wearing a hat or a scarf or nothing on their head? Some people saw a handkerchief. Some people saw a hat. Some people saw nothing. What did they write? Hell, hello, help. They had 3 different words. Everybody saw the same thing. We erased it, so there's no way of knowing what it was. So the memory and what you remember and what you can be as a witness, that's always a question. That's always something you should think about. Evidence 101. The next thing that was important in terms of Mary's involvement was the actual April 14th. That was key. She did go there twice. It was a heck of a long trip. The first time she went out, she did meet with Booth that day. And Louis Whiteman and another woman named Nora Fitzpatrick, who were in the house, who were boarders. As you saw that picture of the boarding house, there were a lot of different boarders in the house. Another one was Eliza Holohan, lived on the 2nd floor with her father. Louis Weichmann's sworn testimony and Nora's testimony on the stand, Louis also testified, was that Booth was there frequently during the time, January, February, March, which was true, undeniable. Mary couldn't deny it. The other thing is, Mary was very stoic. Mary was very distant. Mary was not at all cooperative with her attorneys. She was not, well, he was there to do that. No, didn't give him any ideas, any way to come up with a defense, any way to come up with an explanation. And someone said, John Jr., he blew the coop. He was up in Canada. And I think Pam told me, and I did find this, at the time, at one point, he was in Elmira on a spy mission. He went from Elmira, Canandaigua, he took off for Canada and stayed up there. And he stayed there long enough, and when he finally came back, the statute of limitations had been blown. So he didn't get arrested or charged with anything. I forget what it was, but his life went out in 1904, 1917 or something. He finally died. He threw his mother under the bus, we would say today. He did not show up. He did not write a letter. Nobody knows for sure, but everybody has to believe it. You saw the papers. It was all over everywhere. Mary Surratt's on trial. Trial lasted 6 weeks. And it was in this time of year when it started. Now there's another thing that was important. From a date standpoint, let me get this right, because from a legal standpoint, now if I'm her attorney, ineffective assistance of counsel, and nowhere enough time to prepare, because, it's here somewhere. Here we go. April 3rd, Richmond Falls. Jefferson Davis hightails it, starts out heading for Florida. They only got as far as Georgia. One of the issues that was here, Stanton, he was a bit of a tough nut, Secretary of War. He kind of stepped in and took over. I said, Nixon, can I say Cheney? Any event, he comes in and steps over and takes over. And he wanted very much, Stanton wanted very much to say that Booth had the backing and the support of the Confederate government. Now remember, this is going to feed into the charges of conspiracy against the government. This wasn't John Wilkes Booth individually deciding, I'm going to off Abe Lincoln. This was John Wilkes Booth in a conspiracy of the Confederacy against the Union. So Davis leaves Richmond. Grant's forces are approaching Richmond. I think it's 4-9. Lee surrenders at Appomattox. Talked about that. That's important. But remember, Lee only surrendered the Army of the Northern Virginia. There's still a bunch of people still fighting. There's still an issue that whether or not there's a military tribunal is important. Remember, it's a preponderance of the evidence in a military tribunal. It's beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal. And all 8 of them were tried in a military. Another interesting thing, from a chilling standpoint, they gathered all these people together. They had them in different prisons and stuff, and different jails, the old Capitol Jail, and a couple of, I think they had Ezra Dodd down in southern Maryland someplace. They brought him up. They put him into prison. They tried him into prison. They built there's a picture here, Pam, of the trial. The trial was held in the prison. So in terms of a chilling effect, come on, that's where the trial was held. They're held, she's on the room 200, building 4, whatever, and the rest of them were on the first floor, and they were just moved from one room to the other. They're all right there in the prison. So it wasn't there. And the next thing, okay, the next thing from a timeline, 4/14, that's Lincoln's assassination. Now remember, it was initially a kidnapping, 2 or 3 different versions of a kidnapping. On the 4th, I must do something distinctive. Brought my cough back from Arizona. Good old John Wilkes Booth. That is, he made almost a spur of the moment. You heard the time frame of it. Earlier that day, he learned that supposedly Grant and Lincoln were going to be there so that he could get them both. He also told Ezra Dodd, you got to get Johnson, and he told Powell, you got to get Seward. We're going to take out the top of the cat. We're going to have nobody left. We're going to put the whole Union government into anarchy and chaos. They won't be able to run. That was one of the elements. I got one going. Thank you very much, Diane. That's where part of the element of a conspiracy is coming forth, and it's one government against another government, not John Wilkes Booth trying to off Abe Lincoln.